Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, 4 Keys to Efficient DevOps. I'm Austin from Perfecto Marketing. I'm going to help run this webinar today. And before we get started, I'm going to go over some housekeeping. So the session is being recorded right now. You'll get the recording along with the slides in the next day or two by email. Throughout the webinar, please ask questions in the panel. We'll get to those after the presentation. We'll leave about 10 minutes to answer your questions. And also, there's going to be an end of webinar survey after we end this. So please give us your feedback. We'd love to hear any ways that we can improve. So let's pass it off to our experts.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Carlo Cadet. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Perfecto, and I'll be acting as your host for this conversation. It's a conversation which is a real exciting one to me because I think as an overall, from a market perspective, we're on the cusp of something happening in terms of how organizations are modernizing their development teams and really embracing DevOps. And as we get into the conversation, what we wanted to do today was to move from that marketing phrase, DevOps, to actually dig into some essential aspects of DevOps and what we think are 4 keys to seeing how organizations are transforming and moving from a market buzzword to a reality of how they help deliver software better to their customers. Just to make sure I share with, I want to anticipate a few questions, just to get some housekeeping out of the way. This session is being recorded. After the webinar is complete, the presentation will be shared. And feel free to hit us up with questions and really join the conversation across the various channels that we have listed here. To make the conversation real, what we've done is we've brought in voices from outside of Perfecto to make sure that we actually have a representative view from what different practitioners are seeing as part of their development teams, their development organizations. So I'm excited today to be joined by 4 people who will help lead the conversation and really unpack this idea of 4 keys to DevOps success. And I want my panelists to introduce each of themselves. And let me first start off with Zvika, our very own Director of Product Management here at Perfecto.
Thanks, Carlo. Hello, everyone. My name is Zvika. I'm Director at the Product Management team at Perfecto, responsible for our digital Zoom reporting solution. And I like to define it as helping customers to build a dashboard that makes them smile.
All right. James?
Hi, I'm James Brown, Director of Enterprise Solutions at Vision IT. We do software development, product development. We also do implementation for some products from OpenText and SAP. And we are just recently partners of Perfecto, so I'm excited about this presentation.
Excellent. Welcome to the family. Sean, over to you.
Thanks, Carlo. I'm Sean Williams, Principal Software Engineer at Prism Tech Studios. So I've worked with run development teams for several young startups, growth stage companies, and nonprofits in the past, and currently work with a few different startups.
Awesome. Raj, lastly?
Hey, thanks, Carlo. So my name is Raj, and I work for CSG International. We provide digital streaming and content management services for different companies. I do the mobile test automation for our iOS and Android apps in the company.
Excellent. Great. So as you can see, we have a range of perspectives joining with us to drive this conversation. To kick off the conversation, let me give you a preview of what we're going to dig into. We're going to talk about what I think is a critical practice for software development teams, and that's really the definition of done. James will be driving that conversation, And it's a real indicator of how practices are A, developed, and B, reinforced. And then we'll move on to Raj, who will talk about the requirement for automation and how those gaps impact teams. We'll move on to really focus on the topic that's near and dear to Svika's heart, which is fast feedback, and how fast feedback is a critical aspect of pipelines. And then we're gonna wrap it up on what I also think is the culture aspect, which is something that's not talked about enough, I think, in this conversation. And we're going to focus specifically on the aspect of autonomy as a key enabler for high performance. Before we get started, I want to shift over and just level set the conversation by opening up a poll. This is our first and last poll during today's webinar. So would love to see you guys chime in. So please feel free to jump in and let us know where you are. Because I think while almost everyone is talking about DevOps, you know, I think it's going to be revealing to understand where people actually are in their DevOps journey. I'll give that a minute. You know, we appreciate those people who have already voted. So about a third of you have chimed in, so thanks for that. We're hoping to get about 3/4 of you participating to make it a good sample size here. So guys on the panel, if I was to ask you in summary, where do you think, I'll simplify the poll for you, doing it or talking about it, where do you think the audience is? James, I'll start with you and then move over to Raj.
I think by and large the people who have dialed into this are at least at the talking about it stage and are probably in the, for the most part, in the piloting stage. Okay, great.
Hey, Raj, how about you?
So talking about DevOps journey, in my experience, one aspect which people have to pay attention to is how people have different mindsets when they talk about automation, which eventually leads to automation gaps. So for example, a developer, for him or her, automation would mean something, say, something you do in the QA stage. But for a product owner, automation could be, say, something you do in regression testing phase, right? And finally, say for a tester, automation would be, say, something he wants to automate repetitive tasks which consume a lot of time and leave more time for more critical thinking, exploratory testing activities, right? So these different mindsets in automation also influences the way we think about DevOps.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think for me, one of the conversations of DevOps is really the automate everything conversation. But you know, I think these results from our audience today lines up with what I've been seeing as I interact with our customer base across Perfecto, both in the United States and Europe, and as well as Asia Pacific, is that, you know, a fair amount of everybody wants to do it. You know, only 4% said we're not going there, and I think that's instructive. You know, today's DevOps is in the place where Agile was like 5 years ago. Everyone is moving on the journey towards it. However, the bulk of the audience is that they're in the piloting phase, and I think James, this resonated with your comments earlier. So a full 42% of the folks on the phone today have rolled up their sleeves and are trying it. And we see, for example, nearly 20% of the audience, I think that's fantastic, that's the leading edge, is that, you know, a number of people have fully embraced it across the organization, and others have gone to really some key aspects and dropped anchors, but they've reorganized teams, and they're really retooling their tool chains to get this going. So that's a great place to start. And as we transition the conversation over to James to start us off on what I think is an anchoring element in this conversation. So with that, James, I hand it off to you.
Okay, thanks, Carlo. And to your point, yes, I think, you know, anchoring, foundational, This is one of those things that almost goes without saying, except there are so many flavors of it, interpretations of it, that it's still important to talk about and find some agreement on. So, why is definition of done even a thing? Fundamentally, because so many people have so many different understandings of it. When we look at the promise of DevOps, lean, agile, all of those, it's about raising efficiency at the same time as raising quality. These are all driven by communication in large part. DevOps in particular is about breaking down the silos between various parts of the organization, and that breaking down is in part about improving the communication between what were separate teams. This communication comes up as an issue, as a problem, as something to be dealt with, because there are so many different perspectives in the software development lifecycle, in the deployment lifecycle, in the parts of the enterprise that have a different perspective or different view on what success is for their part of the organization. So developers tend to be very code-centric. The QA group, if they are separate, focuses on testing, test results. Product manager is focused on the product as a whole. Are we meeting the marks? Marketing has a different perspective as well. So what are the means for communicating across the organization? The definition of done becomes important because as we move software through the system, from its idea, from development of or assessment of requirements, into development, into deployment, you bring more and more people into the team. We're all very familiar with the idea that complexity of communication grows exponentially with the size of the team, the group that's being interacted with. One of the huge values. Yep.
One of the points I saw on your slides was it says confidence in go and no go. So I've been in a situation, and I've seen many testers being in a situation where they come and ask, hey, is our product ready to ship, go or no go, right? And we are put in a tricky situation. I think people need to understand in this DevOps journey that testers are not gatekeepers. They're more of information brokers. They provide information about your system, and it's up to the business and the product owners to make a go or no go decision. So just something to think about.
No, I think that's a great point. So fundamentally, what the definition of done is a clear, consistent yardstick yielding a binary answer, right? So QA, as a part of defining the definition of done and as part of executing their functions in the overall process, is not the gatekeeper, right? They are a part of the process, as everyone else is. The responsibility for quality falls across the entire team, right? But the definition of done becomes important because it is the means for communicating to others that your part of the process is completed and has met the assessment that has been defined, right? So in the best case, we're talking about a simple checklist, right? 3 to 10, more than 10 starts to become burdensome. Less than 3 starts to almost become non-functional. You're essentially just asking someone to report, are they done? So typically you will, as you develop your definition of done, and each of these will tend to be different for a team, a project, and enterprise. They will be tailored for the specific situation. To some extent, they are context specific. So definition of done will definitely change from one project to another. But over time, as your organization moves into executing DevOps on a regular basis, you find that the tailoring is really not a significant part of what's going on. Your definition of done has matured along with the maturity of your ability to execute DevOps well, so that everyone clearly understands, and the tailoring is really a restatement of what everyone already knows, believes, and executes. So the tailoring, when you apply that, apply to these different dimensions or aspects of context. So the software development lifecycle, you want to check that the development and testing has been executed as expected, right? The enterprise has concerns around project management. If you are developing software internal to a large organization that is not a software development company, you will often have quality gates around things like architecture, deployment. Those start to play in. System integration concerns may play into the definition of done. If you are developing a product to be sold to other companies, you start to look at shippability concerns, right? And those become part of the definition of done. Oftentimes you will have a definition of done that applies to the team doing the software development, and then another definition of done that applies to release candidates. As I said, maturity is a key factor there. There are many, if you go out and look, there are many definitions of done. There are many examples of the sort of checklist items that you would put into your definitions of done. So as you go through those, you will see they start to align across those contexts or dimensions that I was speaking of. Is the code built? Does it pass all its unit tests? Has it been peer reviewed? Does it meet your development standards? We had mentioned automation. We'll be talking about that more in a bit. Automation can be a key driver to that. And again, getting to that binary answer that you ultimately want, the green or red on your unit tests, is a key driver there, right? As you get into larger enterprise concerns, you start to look at deployment, UAT, deployment artifacts, right? Your development team and operating under a lean, agile model will tend to produce as light a set of documentation as possible. There are times that your customer or your intern or your larger organization, surrounding organization, will have some standards that require a larger set of documentation. So those artifacts become also a part of your definition of done at some level or another. I think if we can move on, the next slide. Yeah, these are several examples, so as you get the recording but also get the PowerPoint sent out, you can go through these. As I say, there are many other sources online for these kinds of examples. And then finally, I just wanted to take a moment and talk about what I see as the largest challenges to implementing the definition of done. Here you see some of the levels, layers, context that we've been talking about. The agreement on the definition of done, who drives that? Most successful is, like many agile methods, lean methods, team-driven, but keeping in mind those contexts or dimensions that I've been talking about. tends to lead to the best resolution. At times there are political issues to navigate. You need to get buy-in from the larger organization. This definition of done is, as we said, a fundamental means of communication to the larger organization or to your customer organization. Because of that, there needs to be an understanding with the customer, with the client, with the larger organization as to the importance of this definition of done, what it means, and what it doesn't mean. Raj, I think you had something else you wanted to add.
Right. So in terms of definition of done, I think you kind of covered it in the sense having a checklist, and whenever a story is complete, we go to the checklist and see whether it actually meets all these criteria. I mean, all the points on the checklist. And once you satisfy all the bullet points on the checklist, then only you move the story to complete. So that practice of respecting your checklist, and as you were saying, the definition of done checklist is be really good, for a DevOps group.
Yes, good point. I think I've already gone over time, so let me quickly hand over to the next topic.
Sure, thanks. You just talked about the importance of automation.
Okay, thanks very much, James. So with that, let me move over to Raj, where Raj is going to talk about addressing automation gaps early. Over to you, Raj.
Carla. Yep. So, yeah, we just talked about the automation aspect in the previous section, but when thinking about automation, you also want to talk about automation gaps, right? So let's address a couple of things related to automation gaps. So if you go to the next slide. So there are different areas of automation gaps, and based on my experience, I categorize them into these 5 major high-level kind of categories. So let's talk about each category quickly and the different things that go with it, right? So the first thing is continuous integration. So when we talk about continuous integration, there's so many things in terms of automation gaps you want to think about. So the first thing is the frequency, right? So whenever your automated test run, you want to make sure it runs on a particular frequency. Usually when a check-in happens, you want your automation to run and give you the necessary results, right? Quite often I've seen this is not the case, and that leads to some gaps. And then visibility under the continuous integration category. So you want to make sure your whatever automated tests you're doing are visible, the reporting is visible, but quite often no one gets to know what's happening due to lack of visibility, right? And even the reporting aspect of it. So whenever an automated test run, you want to generate readable reports, and sometimes we fail to notice that. And finally, in terms of the tests, you want to identify flaky tests, because flaky tests tend to break your automation, especially when you hook it up in a CI job, right? So those are some things you want to think about in terms of automation gaps in your CI. The next thing was the device and simulators. So I don't know about people who are listening to this webinar, but at least for me, I've had a lot of problems running automation on devices when compared to simulators. And people fail to think about it, right? So for example, things like switching between Wi-Fi connection to airplane mode, you cannot do those kind of things on a simulator if you're going to run your automation on simulators. So those are the things you want to identify when you're thinking about hooking automation as part of the DevOps journey. The next one is maintenance. You want to ask yourself some questions in terms of maintenance before coming up with all these ideas for this automation framework, right? So for example, who maintains the test? That quite often people have different answers to that. In general, in my experience, whoever breaks the test needs to fix the automated test, but that's generally not an expectation, and which is, yeah, kind of surprising too, right? And who maintains the server machines? So to run your automation and all your CI jobs, there should be someone maintaining the server machines. So in my personal experience, I've been often the person maintaining the server machine, the automation jobs, as if I own it, but that shouldn't be the case. It should be a whole team approach. And finally, the last 2 points, which is test coverage. We often fail to prioritize what aspects of our functionality we want to automate, and then we say 100% coverage. We use this term loosely and try to automate whatever we see, right? So by doing that, that leads to a lot of gaps in automation. We may miss important functionalities which you actually want to add as part of, say, your smoke test, right? And performance actually goes with it in terms of you want faster feedback when you run your tests. You don't want your smoke test or whatever test you have to run for like 2 hours and then know that your first module which the test ran broke. So those are some of the areas of automation gaps. So if you move on to the next slide, since we talked about what are the areas of automation, and now we also want to think about why you want to find these gaps early, right? So there are 3 things you want to think about. First thing is quick feedback. I kind of already talked about this. The point is you need to get quick feedback whenever you find defects, because the key is find defects early, right? Fail faster than finding problems later in the life cycle. And you also want better visibility. So that's why you want to find these automation gaps early. So what do I mean by that? We need to treat automation as a whole team approach rather than just an automation team handling it, because it's the whole team who is in charge of quality, right? It's not just one group of people. So that is something you want to think about. And there are different ways to make it visible. You could do emails, stand-ups, and in my company, we have these TV screens where we continuously project all these results of our automated tests on the TV screen. So people, as and when they keep walking, they can actually find it. So that is something to think about. And finally, building trust to your automated test. I'm pretty sure a lot of people have the situation where you have this amazing automated test, which you think is amazing, but the problem is it fails most of the times, and people lose trust on your automated test. So you want to find these automation gaps in your test earlier so that you can build trust and some credibility in what you're actually doing. So those are some things you want to think about in terms of why you want to find them early. And finally, if you move on to the next slide, so we talked about what are automation gaps, why you want to find them early, and the final question is, how do you find these automation gaps, right? So the first big thing is planning meetings. Planning meetings is a really good place to actually find these automation gaps. So for example, in our team, in our planning meetings in my company, the whole team sits together and talk about a story. And when I say whole team, it includes the PO, the solution architect, the tech doc writer, then the devs, the QA. So everyone talks about each story. And then you may ask, wow, that's a lot of time, right? But I think when you weigh the cost and the value is a lot. So I can give you an example for this. So I had a story where we were implementing a new screen on our mobile apps to stream different channels. Say, for example, you have ABC. When a user clicks on ABC, the current show playing at that time should start playing on your iPhone or iPad. So I was tasked with automating that story, different flows around it. As and when I started talking about story and discussing it, one of the developers said, hey, you know what? Two iterations from now, we are actually going to do another redesign on the screen. So does it even make sense to actually try to do automation for this particular story, right? So that is a perfect example of why you want to do planning as a team and you want to plan the automation. Second thing was treat automation as separate stories. So you want to respect automation story just like how you would do any feature requirement, right? So you always want to have a separate story to track automated work, because they need considerable amount of work, coding, a lot of things are involved in it. So treat it as separate stories. And also, one thing which we have done is we usually have this kick-off meetings. So what I mean by that is, before starting an automated story or any story for that matter, the developer, the QA, the business person involved, we have a quick 5-minute rundown of the story. We look at the acceptance criteria. We see whether we are clear of the expectations, right? And then the automated story is treated just like any other story, where it goes through the dev, the code review process, testing, then demos, and then finally when all these things are done, then you move it to complete. So that is something you want to think about, and by doing this you can find these gaps really early. And finally, always keep buffer time in mind when you do estimation. So I have an example for this. So we had a story where, again, whatever examples I'm giving is related to streaming, because that's where I work currently. That's what my company does. So one of the stories needed me to do some automation for movies, seasons, rental products, and each movie had single caption, multiple captions. So when I say captions, it's Spanish, English translation, then French translation. So we had all these criteria, right? In this particular story, I failed to keep buffer time in mind. I said, oh, you know what? This like a 3-point story, I can easily do it. And once I started working on the story, then I found out that there's a lot of test data which needs to be set up for me to start doing the automation, right? So that hurt us really bad, but the point is it was a good learning experience. So doing these things which I just talked about helps to find these gaps early, and addressing them makes this DevOps journey much more easier. So that's my experience, Carlo.
Hey, thanks so much, Raj. That's critical. You know, one of the things that I would also add in terms of what I see in terms of what automation teams are doing out there is they're treating their automation like code. You know, so it's not only in terms of assigning responsibility to who's maintaining the software, which is critical. It's also about making sure that they follow the same practices of they check in the code, they test the code, and they're maintaining it. So they're taking a look at the full life cycle aspect, and this is how they're able to kind of accelerate the pace for their own automation development and reliability to what you said as trustworthy. So thanks so much, Raj, for that. I think that's a great segue over to what Svika's going to talk about with regards to feedback, because a lot of this fast feedback is obviously coming on the back of the requirement to automate everything, and in particular testing. Svika, over to you.
Carlo. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Raj. Really, it's a great segue to talk about fast feedback loop within the pipeline, and understand how we can really impact on the visibility and the ability of organization to move fast and fix fast, as you just described. With your permission, Carlo, let's move to the next slide and hit the road about the fast feedback loop. So I think that exactly as Raj mentioned, the integration of more testing into the cycle means that you need to track more moving pieces or parts. And quality visibility is the only way to be able to react on time. we see today, a trend that average number of test execution is rapidly growing among our customers, and the need to manage all this data and understand, or be able to find the needle in the haystack is becoming really a true need. It means that customers are looking for more adaptability and less risk as part of the process. I think that, in a positive mode, it means, for example, that a product manager can take easier decision whether to change a button in a current sprint instead of just, throwing it and creating a backlog item. And on another dimension or another expression of that may be that visibility during the DevOps cycle allows organization really to identify issues earlier in the process, especially during the unit tests and the early phases of the SDLC, and not closer to production, like as part of regression cycle where the fix will have an impact on ROI and can potentially also create delays in delivery. And digital coverage, this should be, built on a modular mode. We see it, as a combination of the functionality that needs to be tested over a matrix of different digital platforms, and with the right combination, of course, of the environment condition. I think that Raj described it perfectly about, the difference between testing something on a simulator or on a real device, with the example of the Wi-Fi versus the airplane mode. So I think that each and every customer that we talk about describe a special use case from a digital coverage perspective that need to be added for testing and need to be included as part of the definition of done. When we talk again about digital coverage, the key here in CI is really to be able to build it, as I've said, in a modular mode, to push only the stable tests to your build and keep adding platforms or environment condition as you go in order to get really to critical mass. Any comments on that, guys?
I think you're right on there, Svika.
Great. So we'll move to the next slide. Yeah, please.
No, I agree with what Svika was saying in terms of, especially in CI, you want to identify those flaky tests, right? And that is one part of it. So yeah, that's a valid point.
Yeah, well, we'll elaborate about that in the coming slide as well. I think, from a velocity perspective, also the ability to get digestible pieces of data is very important. No one likes really to read endless reports and to try, again, as I described, to find that needle in the haystack. So one of the biggest changes between Agile and Waterfall that I can think about as it comes to testing in high frequency is, the ability to get and review the results and filter them per common sense and best practices. You cannot do that, in Agile rhythm, and everything needs to be completely automated and friction-free. So every execution results and the report that you consume in the system need to contain sufficient information that will allow you to completely, generate automatically some correction if needed, and understand what are the fixes that are requirements. So the ability to add contextual elements like tags that will really help you to maybe slice and dice the data to fit your role or to the process that you're managing is the right approach here. We recently introduced a concept that we call RTDD, Reporting Test-Driven Development. It's really all about building the dashboards in your mind and design them and accordingly build your tests and report the relevant contextual pieces in order to assemble, I would say, the ultimate quality visibility that you look to get. With that, I'll move to the next slide to describe a little bit the process within Perfecto and the way that we see that. And I think, really connecting to Raj's part, you can see on the left side, this is the reporting team at Perfecto. And the thing that they have behind them hang on the wall is exactly those dashboards and the ability to get quality visibility during the process. When we come with an idea for a new feature or for a new service, we start on the right upper side as part of the planning and the project management elements. So we create epics, mega epics, and translate them later on as part of the dev into user stories in different tools that manages that I guess that all of you know. Then code is being generated by the skilled developers in the team, managed in different source control environments. And then I think that one of the important pieces is also to use your product as a user. So we test things using the Perfecto environment, the Perfecto real devices, the Perfecto reports. And by using that, we also come into some best practices and I would say even special development, like getting the results back, or attached to your tool chain. So our developer lives in Slack environment, so they would naturally like to get the test results back on their Slack environment. So that's exactly what we have developed and introduced recently. On top of that, the entire build and deployment elements, the team has like 20 different builds of services that are running on a daily basis in separate branches. And everything is, compiled in a way that we can push to production on a daily basis, like in continuous deployment mode. We can monitor everything, and if something breaks and we see an issue, we can push a fix to production immediately. And also very important piece is the ability to track the usage, understand flows from different metrics, and again, plan and iterate accordingly very quickly, very easily, and make an impact in a very short time frame. The next slide really is about the reliability. Again, something that Raj mentioned. I think that in DevOps, your script execution must be reliable. So those execution must give a true result about the execution and must be consistent over time. And if consistency is not there, we see some problems. I think that the next slide will really describe the breakdown that we usually see and estimate in Perfecto. If we can move to the next slide and discuss about the why, to understand why tests fail in CI in such high pace. So the common, I would say the common practice of 5 to 10% of false negative is not something that should be happening in DevOps. It means that manual verification of test result is not required in DevOps in order to reach to a decision point. Things should happen like automatically, especially when you run on a daily basis those cycles. It's just not possible. That, as I've mentioned, the reporting team at Perfecto can run the same build few times a day. So if they will have to analyze the executions one by one, it may be that they will impact 2 days later or not in a sufficient time frame. We heard from some of our customers, as part of the validation process of some of the dashboards that we built for management, that they spend 10 to 15 hours on a weekly basis just to assemble reports for management. To me, it means that management cannot impact and cannot get go or no-go decision in real time, and this is something which is very important. And I see few recommendations about the desired state that can be shown in the next slide. I think that the desired state should be, if we may go to the next one, that the dashboards that you build should really reflect the current and reliable quality status, and serve as a base for decision making in real time. And you can enforce that and build, a trustworthy process of DevOps within your organization. And some of the ideas or the recommendations that we bring to life when we talk with customers are around, what you do when you identify a failure. So if it's a failing test that is really critical, I think that common sense would say that you should prioritize it to an immediate fix. It can be on a critical platform or a critical or a killer feature that should be always green or up and running. If it's something which is not critical, we see many organizations that use the P1, P2, P3 model. So according to the priority bucket, they can define whether this feature will be prioritized for a fix in a close or medium time frame. But I think that also a good idea is about building heuristics that define what is a failure. So the 3 strikes out model, like a test wouldn't consider it as a failed one if it hadn't at least failed 3 times. So this is also a direction or an option that can make sense. But overall, if a test is not critical, you should either comment it out or skip it from the framework side, and by that eliminate the reddish part in your build. But you also need to make sure or indicate that you have an open bug for this test, so that your defect management tool won't be blasted with additional defects about the same issue. From here, I think that the idea of building a healthy process really to eliminate or decrease the number of the false negatives is really an important piece. Probably you heard about the 3 R's, but the basic idea is around building an effective retry mechanism where you can, again, reiterate the same test and make sure that is not something which is really related to the execution itself. Run it in a recovery activity, like making sure that all the preconditions were defined properly on your end, and maybe run some recovery cycle for specific devices. And I think that the last resort is about, redundancy, and make sure that your environment is really stable and there is nothing that you haven't thought about in terms of trying to execute on a parallel or a similar platform or similar environment condition that will simulate it in a different mode, but on a parallel platform. And by that, the ability to isolate small failures that change the picture in your DevOps cycle is the important piece. I think that it takes some time to get to a stable build. You should start with small pieces, like building 2 to 3 basic builds that can consist even one test, and then start adding more and more pieces to have a reliable quality picture across the entire pipeline. Does this make sense, Carlo?
It does. Well said, Zvika. Let's just, at this point, I think it's best we hand it over to Sean to wrap up on the subject of autonomy. I think it's just a critical aspect of the conversation. I'm excited to have Sean share his viewpoints. Thanks, Zvika. Handing it over to Sean.
Cool. Thanks, Carlo. So I just want to talk kind of quickly about autonomy for autonomy for customer-focused experiences. So when I'm saying autonomy, what is that? It's letting people and processes fly with as little interference as possible. So if you've ever worked for a small startup, a brand new company, a project that you're launching as the sole tech person on it, it's very quick to iterate. And that changes as our teams get bigger, as our code gets more complex, more stuff just gets in the way of getting things done. So the goal of autonomy is to get as much of that stuff out of the way as possible and let our teams focus on the end user as much as they can, as Savika was mentioning, to give more adaptability and less risk to the business. So I think of two types of autonomy. Process autonomy is building systems and processes that minimize the error associated with repeated delivery. And that is how we work faster. Cultural autonomy is about working smarter. It's about aligning your technology team with customer interests. And when you do that, you can make better and quicker decisions. So let's go ahead and dive into process autonomy on the next slide. So there's a lot of different ways we can speed up our work and minimize the error associated with repeatable tasks. And I like to think of all of these in ranges. You could be at different places with all of these. For automated builds and deployments, you can have absolutely nothing. You can be in the left on the red where everything is manual. You can be on the right and have full continuous integration. You deploy with a single click of a button. Nobody has to think about it. It's almost too easy to deploy. For staging environments, you could have, do you have a staging environment that properly simulates production? You might not. For documentation, I personally love writing documentation, and I know I'm in quite the minority with that, but it is part of process autonomy because it makes it so your team has as little blocking them as possible. If you were new at your company, how much information could you find out without having to ask someone who already knows it? And how easy is it to get that information? And with that, a little can go a long way. To use an example from a company I was at, we had a very complex system to send customer emails. The business logic was just spread out across many parts of the system. There was logic on our consumer website. There was logic on a back-end service bus. We also had a third-party CRM that handled sending our emails, handled not sending the emails if people were unsubscribed. There was some additional logic in templates there. So it was very helpful to outline that system at a high level in documentation. Didn't have to be long, kind of a one-pager. And if you were a brand new developer to the company, if you were at the company but working on emails for the first time, that was really helpful to hand over with our product requirements and say, oh, and here's a starting point for just where to go into this system. And in the long run, that saves a lot of time. And just like definition of done, this is all very context specific. What your needs are for these are going to totally depend on your team and project. I'm working on a project now that is an application that only has to be up for 5 hours during a live event. So I am not worried about automated deployments. That would be a waste of time. If you have a big team, even small improvements in one of these areas can scale dramatically across your team if you save everybody just a little bit of time. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide into cultural autonomy. And again, this is how we work smarter. So cultural autonomy is empowering your team to do what's best for the end user. When you do that, it's highly motivating for your team. I recently reached out to several developers I've managed in the past, and this came up with all of them. Everybody said it's very important for me to know what is going on in the bigger picture. I really want to know how what I am doing impacts the end user, impacts the business. And then also when everyone on your team knows that, it makes for better decisions and quicker decisions. So how do we align our team with the end user? Because most of us, we might run through the product like we think an end user would, but we're not truly users of our products unless we work for, like a Stack Overflow or a company that is catering to us in technology. So one of the best ways to do this is sharing end user data. This kind of stuff, it's A/B testing results, email campaign metrics, Google Analytics data. That is very, in my experience, that's very commonly circulated among departments outside of technology. It's very, there's emails going around with, among the marketing department, hey, did you see these numbers? Look at how, look at the uptick and how many people are going to this page. That stuff should be circulated among technology. And if you do any kind of product feedback sessions, focus groups, demos, that stuff is amazing because you're hearing directly from the customer what they're thinking. It is also very time consuming. If you have the time, it's very fun to go be a fly on the wall in those sessions, and you get to hear, it's very cool to just hear things in the customer's voice. But let's be real, we probably do not have time to go to those sessions, so if you can get your product department to send notes from those meetings in executive summary, you're doing the work to hear directly from your customers and users. Let the technology part of your organization benefit from that. Sharing business goals and priorities. This stuff can really get lost at the lower levels of your organization, so just be sure everybody knows what are your quarterly goals, what are your key performance indicators, how are the features you're working on supposed to affect the key performance indicators, and then do the follow-up. Once you release those, did they impact them? Regardless of if they impacted them positively, negatively, or not at all, that's very useful information about your users. One caveat to all of this is sometimes there are stakeholders that are not the actual end user. Sometimes you're doing something for partnerships you hope to have in the future, potential investors. To use an example from a SaaS company I was at, we had all of this data on mergers and acquisitions. Now, I had access to the user data, and I knew nobody used this data at all when they used our product. But as it turns out, this came up on every sales call. Everyone would want to dig into this data as sort of a litmus test. People knew this company got acquired 2 days ago. Let's check and see if this is in the product. So that was a feature that was for people with purchasing power, but not necessarily used by the end user. So just to summarize, this is cultural. It takes time to change, but if you empower your team to do what's best for the end user, to think about the end user by sharing user data, business goals, priorities, this provides context that is very motivating for your team and lets them make better and faster decisions.
Hey, Sean, thanks very much for that. That was really insightful and I think important. You know, over the course of today's webinar, we wanted to really press upon 4 key points. You know, and that's with regards to, you know, what James mentioned with regards to the definition of done. It is a critical communication anchor for the conversation about how teams are executing DevOps and increasing their performance. You know, from an automation perspective, obviously DevOps requires the principle of automate everything, and testing in particular. But the issue is that tests need to be reliable, trustworthy, and respected to be invested appropriately. And then has to come, with that comes visibility into the feedback. Fast feedback is critical, and that means being able to share the visibility of where we are to drive confidence ultimately in go, no-go decisions. And the way to kind of get this whole machine going is with the culture of the organization and the autonomy of teams to do the right thing at the right time. And so thanks for your comments, James, Raj, Svika, and Sean, because they've been really insightful. And for the audience, please take a look at the our report that's coming out today with regards to how developers are spending their time and in moving towards the DevOps pattern. I think you're going to find that really insightful. So hopefully for the audience, this has been a great use of your time. We thank you for joining and sticking with us. So thanks, panelists. Thanks, audience. Have a great day.